a young town planner named James Craig won a competition, and his plan was adopted to be the plan of the old new town. Now this was in the 1760s. We're under the reign of George III. And I'm sure if you're American, you'll remember George III. You threw a little tea party for him in Boston. You remember? You tipped all the tea. No taxation without representation. So it was all under the reign of George III. And I'm sure you've seen the movie, The Madness of King George. They called it the Madness of King George. In Britain, they were going to call it the Madness of King George III. But they thought people would get confused and say, well, I never saw the first one and I didn't see the second one. How come they just go straight to the third one? But if you haven't seen that movie, I would highly recommend it. So I already mentioned in St Andrew Square, we have the statue of Henry Dundas, King Henry IX of Scotland. But I want to mention some of the other characters who all lived in this area. So people were living cheek by jowl in the old town. People were getting attracted over to the new town as the new houses were being built. But this was also a centre of productivity. Nowadays, when you're in St Andrew Square, most of the buildings here are now hotels and restaurants. This used to be all insurance companies. Scotland had the highest, or the fourth highest amount of money and investment in Europe. So it went London, Paris, Frankfurt and Edinburgh. This whole street of George Street, the main street in the new town, named after George III, was actually known as the Money Mile. So with all the insurance companies on this side here, life assurance, long-term investments, banks, all the way down the main street here, down George Street, linked at the other end in Charlotte Square. Charlotte was the Queen of George III. And that's where we had the fund managers who would do more short-term investments. But this was a wealthy city. And as Mike said, it made a lot of its money through the slave trade, through tobacco. I think we've got a nice little toot from somebody there, thank you. But I want to mention some of the famous people here. We'll just go across the street here. We've talked before about the Renaissance that took place here in Scotland. In the 1700s, the middle of the 1700s, 1746 to be precise, was the last battle that was fought on British soil. This is when the civil wars officially ended here in the UK. That meant that the country could start to look outside. This is where empire building came. And this is where a lot of the Scots took part, because they were highly educated. They were working their way up these organisations, not only in the military, but also in financial institutions. They were working their way up, becoming very powerful, and started to help to build the British Empire. Good or bad, it happened, the empire was there. But at the same time, there was a renaissance in terms of education. Edinburgh was famous for its scientists, for all the new developments that were taking place, and one of the famous characters I want to point out to you is this character here. This is James Clerk Maxwell. Now he was born in 1831, so he was right in the middle of the 19th century. James Clerk Maxwell was famous for his research and scientific discoveries in electromagnetism. So you'd actually say that he was probably, quite possibly, the father of computing. He was contemporary of Charles Babbage. Remember, Babbage was the one who invented the adding machine. Clerk Maxwell took on research that was already being developed and took it to a different level. It's said that of all the scientists, that if you take a poll of the top 100 scientists, then he always comes up in the top 3. His famous equation, Maxwell equation, is actually put on the sidework for you. So I'm going to test all you mathematicians and all you scientists here. But every computer building here at the universities in Scotland always have a James Clerk Maxwell building named after him. You can see him there with his little Skye Terrier. But Maxwell came after another famous woman. Now we all talk about the great men of science, but there's a famous woman, her name was Mary Somerville, and she was often very much overlooked. She was a physicist. Quite often she was very much self-taught, autodidactic, but she did force herself into education. She married her first marriage was to one of her cousins, and he was in the military and they moved down to London, and he didn't believe that women should be educated, but she had a hunger for learning and a hunger for education. When he died, she moved back up here. Now, she was born in the end of the 1700s. She was a contemporary of Sir Walter Scott, Also contemporary of James Clerk Maxwell, he came along later, so there was an overlap with them. He was very much well aware of the work that she had done. She was the first female member of the Royal Astronomical Society and the first woman to have her paper read at the Royal Society of London. She broke grounds completely. And not only in terms of her gender, but also in the science that she was famous for. There is a college in Oxford University called Somerville College, which is named after Mary Somerville. And a few years ago, we had a competition with one of the banks and to see what characters we should put on our banknotes. Now, if you look at Scottish banknotes, we don't have a picture of the Queen on any of our Scottish banknotes. We do have the Bank of England, but not in any of the banknotes here in Scotland. But we do have Mary Somerville on the banknote, and that was given a testament to her contribution to science in the 19th century. She died and she was buried in Italy. I'm going to read out a little quotation which is part of her obituary, because when she died, the Morning Post, the British Morning Post, declared that whatever difficulty we might experience in the middle of the 19th century in choosing a king of science, there could be no question whatsoever as to who the Queen of Science is. So she was known as the Queen of Science. It's Mary Somerville, Somerville. So a big shout out for the ladies. It's always the men who get all the great men of science, the great men of economics, the great male philosophers. But let's give a shout out for Mary Somerville, a great Scottish woman. She's well remembered, and as I said, she's got a college in Oxford University named after her. But only a couple of hundred yards from here, there's another great man who is born just at the other end of the street here. And again, these were all overlapping, these people. So we always ask people who invented the telephone. And someone always comes up with they said it was a famous American. Who was that famous American that invented the telephone? Alexander Graham Bell. He wasn't American. Sorry to burst your bubble there. He was actually Scottish, and he was born here just 100 yards, a couple of hundred yards down the street here. Another famous character, again a contemporary of all these people. They were all leading on. The amount of research and new ideas that were bubbling up in the city, which continued for over the 100 years. Just a couple of hundred yards down to the left of me down here, we have some of our great authors who's there. You know, we have Robert Louis Stevenson. Just other side of the square, we have Arthur Conan Doyle, famous for Sherlock Holmes. But another famous character that I like to mention is James Young. Now, James Young, he discovered chloroform. Again, one of these great scientists, well, based in Edinburgh. And the story is that when he discovered chloroform, he wanted to get the idea how good it would be for anesthesia. So he would invite people down to his house, and he would knock his wife out. So he would have chloroform parties that would knock each other out, and they would stick pins in each other. Plus ça change, nothing really ever changes. So let's move a little bit along George Street. Now, as you look along George Street, Mike's already mentioned that it was all about the unification. It was all about Scotland being part of the Great Britain. So we have the Rose Street and we have Thistle Street that run parallel to George Street. We also have the Georges were of the House of Hanover, so they were Hanoverian. So we also have Hanover Street, we have Princes Street, named after the princes, and we have Prince Frederick. So we have Frederick Street as well. So it was all part of this, Scotland being part of this new idea of the new Great Britain, the new United Kingdom. Now, we've got one big building here. This is probably the most prestigious address in terms of finance in the whole of Edinburgh. This is number 1 George Street. And this was where Standard Life, one of the most famous financial institutions in Scotland and in Great Britain and probably in Europe, were based. Standard Life is now taken over by Aberdeen Asset Management, so it's now known as Aberdeen Standard. The thing about the new town was that the streets were really, really wide. These were big boulevards. You have to imagine in those days there'd be coach and horses coming down here. In the 1700s, the early 1800s, there would be places where the families would meet. They would have arranged marriages effectively. They would have the balls where the young ladies would be displayed, literally displayed. And so one of the places they would do this would be in going to church on a Sunday. They would all wear their Sunday best and go to the church. And one of the famous churches that I would highly recommend when you come into George Street itself is just coming up past There's some work getting done on the building here, but just past this. And again, you'll see the neoclassical architecture that was being built everywhere in the new town. Now, one of the famous churches is this one coming up on the right. This is St. George. There's a St. George and St. Andrews. St. Andrews and St. George West. And the building itself is actually oval shaped. So there is this joke about, well, why did they build churches in Scotland to be oval? Well, it's so that Scotsmen cannot hide in the corner when the plate comes round. That's a bit of a self-deprecating joke here. But churches are usually open and they invite you to walk in. I'll just have a little look, see if we can see here. But it's the architecture of the church. And this church itself is famous because in the middle of the 1800s, the Church of Scotland had the Great Schism that actually split. And it was called the Great Disruption. And the disruption meant that the congregations almost split in half. The reason it's split in half is that because we mentioned before about the Church of Scotland being a flat organisation, the Presbyterian Church, there's nobody above you, you make your own decisions at local level. But then there was this movement where the wealthy or the lairds up north wanted to nominate their ministers and their priests, or the ministers of the kirk. And there was a rebellion. People didn't want that. People did not want these wealthy people nominating who their ministers would be on a Sunday. So they rebelled. And they marched out of their churches up in the old town and marched over here. So this church here is always it's always associated with the Great Disruption. This building across the street used to be a banking hall as well, and a grand banking hall it was as well. This is where I used to have my branch actually. It's one of my bank here. This is part of the Royal Bank of Scotland. However, all the financial institutions more or less have moved out of the new town of Edinburgh. There's a new part of the city out by the airport where a lot of the financial institutions moved. These buildings were left vacant. This was now taken over. This building now is called the Dome. It's absolutely beautiful inside. It's a great place for dinner, great place for high tea, champagne, cocktails. The food is excellent and I would highly recommend it when you come here. And if you're here at Christmas time, it has the tallest Christmas tree in Edinburgh, and it's well worth a visit to go and see it. And all of the pillars are wrapped up in greenery. It's very, very Christmassy. Now, I did mention the Royal Society. The Royal Society was a society for scientific development, and it's where people come and discuss. And the Royal Society still exists today, and it's a great place for the sharing of new ideas. You can share the ideas in a safe place. Papers are still presented. And it was here that Mary Somerville presented one of her papers here. And it's the one with the green dome that Mike can pick up here. And this is the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Now, I know that a lot of people from North America, you do this thing where you love to come to Europe, and what you want to do is you want to pick up a t-shirt from the Hard Rock Cafe. Well, here we go. Across the street here on George Street, you can pick up all your merchandise here at the Hard Rock Cafe. Love all, serve all. That's the Hard Rock Cafe.